All right. Well, good. Glad to see you. Hope you had a good week. And hope this week goes well for you. Last week we talked a little bit, not a lot, but we talked a little bit about the difference between doctrine and opinion. And we have to know and remember that even in church, there are things that we do and the way we do them that really are matters of opinion. And your opinion is as valued as mine. And sometimes, even in those opinion areas, there are individuals that have to make the decisions on what to do, namely, of course, the elders. Sometimes it's those decisions are fairly easy, and sometimes they're not. And invariably, when you get into those times of opinion, when you begin to make those decisions, sometimes it's going to affect some folks in a negative way, and that creates difficulty, and that creates problems, and consequently, leaders are very vulnerable, and we should appreciate leaders when they make those decisions, even if we don't like the decisions that they make. And hopefully we can always have an open communication with them from the standpoint of we can go up and say, now, I don't like what you've done, but I will, I'll go along with it. Because the next time when something comes up, and there'll be a next time, and if there's not, it's going to all be ended anyway, and it's not really going to matter, but there'll be a next time. And when there's a next time, voice your opinion. And, if you handle your stuff correctly, they may decide to go the way you want to the second time. And so it's important that opinions be held as just that, opinions. Doctrine, we cannot change. Doctrine is there. Doctrine is established. Well, in Acts 15, there is a problem. Or, there was a problem. There is, as we're studying it, but there was a problem. And the problem was, what do we do with regards to the teaching of circumcision plus Christianity? In other words, folks that were teaching and that are having a problem in Acts 15 were these. They had come and they had said, okay, you want to be a Christian, you want to be baptized, okay, but we're also saying that in order to fulfill the law, you got to be circumcised. Because remember, circumcision under the old law was, the Old Testament was the, if you will, the sign in the flesh that said we are God's children, we are children of God. So there were those that were saying that, and basically the understanding was this is a matter of opinion. This is not true. We don't have to do this. Now, it's not condemning the fact that, say, one may want to do this, but one has to do it. There's a difference. And so the discussion came about in Acts 15. They decided, Paul and others decided to, if you will, send it to Jerusalem. There were religious leaders, elders, there were folks that were there that could make that decision with insight and wisdom. And so basically the decision that they made was such that, as we studied last week, they gave certain parameters and they said, this is what we suggest. We came to the conclusion, or I came to the conclusion, you may not have, but I came to the conclusion that these were things that were suggested, but not necessarily had become or had to become part of the law itself. In other words, these aren't things that Christians have to do today. And it talked about, the eating of meats that basically had been bled, don't drink blood, sexual immorality, things of that nature. Now, other scriptures cover certain of those things, not all of those, but cover certain of those things, and so those things are handled somewhere else. But there is still that problem, and there is that discussion. And when we get to Acts 15 and we get to verse 30, we kind of see the ending of all of this. They sent off, and they came to Antioch, and they gathered the multitude together. They delivered the letter. This is the letter that had been signed, the decision that had been made. and the recommendations that had been given. And when they read it, they rejoiced over its encouragement. So it's kind of interesting because you see, kind of what it says to do and not to do, and yet they saw it as a sign of encouragement. That's just kind of interesting to me, because we look at things and we see, do and don't do, and that's not encouraging. But they saw it as, and I'm sure there were more things in the letter than that. But anyway, now Judas and Silas themselves, being prophets, also exhorted and strengthened the brethren with many words. And after they had stayed there for a time, they were sent back with greetings from the brethren to the apostles. However, it seemed good to Silas to remain there. Paul and Barnabas also remained in Antioch, teaching and preaching the word of the Lord with many others also. So they come back to Antioch. This is where Paul and Barnabas had left from in the first missionary journey. They came back, and they came back to give a mission report. And so they tell them, they spend time encouraging them, exhorting them, strengthening them, of course, especially Judas and Silas, encouraging and strengthening them and making sure that the brethren are built up. Remember, the church is not very old. I mean, we're what, 48 AD, somewhere in that neighborhood. So the church is not very old, and brethren need strengthening, the brethren need direction, and they're looking for that. And so that's what they do. And so Paul and Barnabas remain in Antioch. Let's go on 15th chapter, because it's something that happens not long after that. Now think about it. Paul and Barnabas had gone on a missionary journey, been gone for several months. Very successful ministry, had been to Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, and such places, had gone and basically came back, except for the Isle of Cilicia. They came back the way they went. Came back to Antioch, gave their report. They're on fire. They're excited. When Adriano goes back to Brazil here in the next little bit, he's going to be super excited to see his family, see his wife and his little children, but he is also going to be on fire. He's going to be very excited about the work, because he's been gone for a while. He's gotten some new breath within him, the things that he's learned here for the singing aspect that he does, for the new work that he's going to be involved with. And so he's excited about all of that. And that's the way Paul and Barnabas felt. Well, not long after that, Paul said to Barnabas, let's go back and visit our brethren in every city where we've preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. Great idea. Let's go back. Let's go back home, or to places. Let's go back and let's see the brethren. Let's see how they're doing. Let's make sure we can strengthen them, build them up. And so Paul is a church builder. Barnabas, verse 37, was determined. The word determined is a good word, good English word. Behind it in the Greek text is the idea he was resolved. In other words, he was firmly planted. And the tense of the verb would indicate that this was not just something that was a passing fancy. He was dead set on what? To take with them John, called Mark. Now, we remember John Mark, he started out with them on the first missionary journey. We're never really told why. We assume certain things about why he went home, and we seem to, we might imply something from something, but we really, from a standpoint of just a flat out statement, this is why he went home, I don't find it. But he went home, went back, he left them. And so notice what it says, Barnabas is determined, but verse 38, Paul insisted. And just as determined as Barnabas was, and just dead set in that resolve and continued in it, Paul continued that idea of insisting. Paul continued to insist that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia and not gone with them to the work. Then the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another. Contention. The contention there, the word contention there, is this got heated. This was not just a little discussion where Paul said, hey, Barnabas, let's go back and let's see the brethren. Let's go talk to them, build them up, and strengthen the church. And Barnabas says, good idea. Let's take John Mark. And Paul said, let's don't do it. And Barnabas said, yeah, he's all right. He's a good guy, And Paul says, well, maybe he's not seasoned enough. And this, we're talking about going back. And, we ran into some things there on that first journey. And we're probably going to run into some things, if not more things now. And he's a young guy. He's not settled. And Barnabas says, no, we're going to take him. And so it kept going back and forth. And if things get to going back and forth, what do they usually do? They get a little loud, don't they? And we become ingrained, entrenched. Well, that's what's happening. I give you a personal example for yourselves to think about. If I call you tomorrow, and I'm not going to do this, by the way. Well, I may call you, but not this way. If I call you tomorrow, and I say, and right now you don't have your mind made up of who you're going to vote for president in 2024. And I say, who are you going to vote for in 2024? And you say, well, I don't know. I hadn't made up my mind. And I say, no, you got to make up your mind right now. I don't know. No, you got to make up your mind. I'm doing a poll, and you got to make up your mind right now. And you say, whoever it is you say. Psychologists teach us that more than likely you will defend that person even if you find out they are the scum of the earth, which pretty much includes all the politicians. But anyway, it doesn't matter because you've set your mind a certain way and you're going to hold to it come whatever. Well, Paul and Barnabas had their mindset. You weren't going to change it. And so it gets a little heated. And notice what it says. The contention became so sharp. When you get into looking at the words themselves, it's the idea of, you watched heat. The white heat, hottest. That's the idea of the word. This became sharp. They parted from one another. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Now, I want us to think about 2 or 3 things here that come to mind, at least to my mind, through experiences that I've had and through just thinking about those scriptures. First of all, notice the fact that we look at this and we look at it as a bad thing. And I always will tell you, it is a bad thing when brethren disagree and hold an opinion so strong that they're not willing to listen and consider and then to move on. I mean, there's no telling how many times I've rendered opinions and people have looked at me like I was crazy. And that's fine. And that's, I think that's the way it should be. I may not agree with you. I may not agree with you at all, but I'm willing to listen to you. I may not do what you say, but I'm willing to listen to you. For part of the reason, if I listened to everybody and did what everybody told me, I couldn't do anything. Through the years, I've had people tell me how to preach, and I understand we all have the styles that we like. But I've had them say, you need to pound the pulpit more. You need to carry us over the pits of hell more. You need to do this. You need to do that. Or I've had others say, you preach too hard. I've had some say you preach too long. I've had some say you preach too short. I had one deacon once many years ago that said, I've never heard a short sermon condemned. I said, stay with me. You will. Because you see, if you don't preach long enough, all of a sudden you're sticking the congregation. You're making way too much for the little work that you're doing. If you preach too long, guess what? We hadn't made it to wherever we're going to go eat, and you're a terrible guy. You can't win for losing. That's all right. That just comes with the territory. You understand that. It's not fun, but it is part of it. You just listen, nod your head, and smile, and say thank you. I appreciate it. You consider it. I think you have to consider it, and then you do the best that you can. Well, differences sometimes lead to problems. Paul and Barnabas divided. Congregations have split. Not all congregations that split because of doctrinal reasons. Now, some do. A disagreement with regards to taking the Lord's Supper, how the worship is to be conducted. You know, one of the things, not so much around in this area, but especially out in Texas, the idea of ladies and ladies taking an active part in the worship service from the standpoint of leading prayer, preaching, so forth and so on. And we see that in the Baptist, the Methodist, Presbyterians are all fighting over that same issue in their conferences. But you would say, okay, that's a doctrinal issue. Well, what's an opinion? An opinion would be whether the elders are capable and able of leading a congregation or not, whether the preacher needs to go or stay, things like that. This was a matter of opinion. Who do we take with us? Churches that split, though, split most of the times, not all the times, but most of the times on matters of opinion. When brethren need to learn to get along. I'm not real sure if we can't get along here on earth, how we're going to get along in heaven. Just a thought. So then we move to a second idea. Sometimes a little division doesn't hurt. You might say, preacher, you done lost your marbles. Think about this. Paul takes Silas, Barnabas takes John Mark. They cover twice the territory, right? Twice the ground, twice the number of folks impacted. And so consequently, that's a good thing. So sometimes out of bad things come good things. I think I shared with you this story back a couple of years ago. I was in a community, I was preaching, and there was another congregation in the community, and the preacher had retired. And when he retired, he stayed retired for a little while. Preachers don't usually retire, they just slow down. And so, ask Jay's dad, he's the same way, still preaching. But this preacher, he just found a little church outside the city limits, and he started going there to preach. And I had heard that there had been a little squabble, and that a few of their members had left because one or two had come visited us. They didn't stay, but they'd come and visited us. And so anyway, I was at the gas station one day. I was pumping gas, and all of a sudden this preacher pulls up. And we start talking, and I said, well, is everything all right, congregation? And he said, well, we've had a little trouble. And I said, yeah, I'm sorry. I hate to hear that, because really and truly the church doesn't shine when it's fighting. It really doesn't. And I said, I hate to hear that, and I'm sorry. He said, well, Paul, he says, really, it's turned out to be the best thing. He said, sometimes by subtract, or when you subtract, you really add. And so sometimes you do. Well, the addition here would be twice the coverage. So I have to be careful. Let's also note something. It would seem to be that as time went on, this problem became not a problem. Paul writes, and he writes to Timothy, and he says, send who? With the letters. John Mark. Evidently, John Mark all of a sudden was not somebody that Paul looked down upon. Maybe he had grown. Maybe he had seasoned. Who knows? Maybe Paul had changed his thoughts. Maybe Paul had matured a little more. and mellowed a little more. But also, evidently, Paul did not just so hate Barnabas that it was one of those situations where, well, I can't talk to him and I can't see him and I don't want to talk to him. Because there's a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that talks about Barnabas and seems to talk about him in verse 6 as if Paul and Barnabas are all right. And so it would imply then, because 1 Corinthians would be later than here, about a little after 1 Corinthians or Acts 15, that Paul and Barnabas came back together again. Now, maybe they weren't the best of buddies. Who knows? But it wasn't a matter of, well, I'm not going to talk to them. I'm not going to be with them. I'm not going to associate with him. I can't even recommend him to come and kill the flies in my house. It seems that they're all right. And so it is a thought that sometimes, even when we have disagreements with folks, and even when we part, yea, but for a season, and maybe we don't want to necessarily be best friends and we don't want to live next door to each other, we can still say, I still love you. I care for you. Everything's all right. And we'll just learn to love each other, but at a distance. That's not easy, but it is sometimes something that needs to be thought about. Anything else in this chapter? Okay, well, let's get to the 16th chapter. Guess what? Second missionary journey. We are, and I looked up 3 different chronological plans that I have. I have several, but 3 different chronological that I've been kind of looking at as we've been going through Acts. 2 of them said that this was about AD 49 to 51. One of them said it was 51 to 52. I lean towards the 2 that say it's 49 to 51 because those are the 2 I've always kind of gone by anyway. But needless to say, that gets you in the time frame of where we are. We're progressing on. Remember, 33 AD, basically Acts 2. We're now 49, say 50 AD, somewhere in that neighborhood. And we have the second missionary journey. It's interesting that Luke, for whatever reason, and I think we will see this in just a second, but Luke, for his very own reason, chooses in his history of the church to follow Paul. He doesn't follow Barnabas. He follows Paul. Now, I can't give you a reason why, other than if you go down to about verse 11 or 12, he begins talking about we. And the pronoun goes from he to we. It would seem to imply that about verse 11, Luke became a sojourner, Paul. And so there may have been, and of course Luke's mentioned again in Paul's writings, but Luke may have been a closer friend to Paul. Maybe that's a possible suggestion than maybe he was to Barnabas. Maybe he thought that Barnabas had a more important journey or that he had a better plan. It doesn't say. But I believe, of course, by the providence of God and by the hand of God, that this is the if you will, this is the story God wanted told throughout time for all of mankind, for the salvation of mankind. And that's why Luke really chose Paul. But needless to say, it is on this journey that we find several things that are interesting. And Luke, though, picks up with the story of Paul. Then he came to Derbe and Lystra. Now, you might remember Lystra on the first trip. This is where Paul was stoned and left for dead. But they came to Lystra and Derbe. Pretty courageous, brave individual, I'd think. Go back to a city that, while the Christians accepted him, the non-Christians were, let's put him to death. And so they tried. And behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. Now you get the story. Jewish woman, mother of Jewish background, and you had a father who would be Greek. Father would be uncircumcised. Father would be, at least from the culture of that day, his father would have come from a very polytheistic upbringing. Greeks had many gods, not just one or two. They had a lot. And so, not saying that his father was polytheistic, I'm just saying his background would have been polytheistic. But notice with regards to Timothy, he was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted to have him go with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in the region, for they all knew that his father was Greek. Circumcision. We talked about it in Acts 15. We'll not talk about it a lot more. We understand the physical aspects of it. We also understand the spiritual aspects of it. But think about this. Timothy had not been circumcised. There's part of it. I'm sure that part of it was due to the fact that his father was Greek. But Paul decides to make him do that which he had really been saying you don't have to do. Now, the other aspect that I think of is that Timothy, being a grown man and being circumcised in that day, the way they did it would have been terrible. No anesthesia. Very sharp rocks were used instead of a scalpel. Just terrible to think about. Timothy evidently did this and must have done it willingly. But Paul says that he took him and he circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region. He had to have an effect. And Paul felt like Timothy had to have an effect upon the folks that he was going to go talk to. Paul talked about becoming all things to all men. For what reason? That he might by all means win some, right? Now, this is a tricky subject to say the least. And in part, it's eking over even into our own worship today, in part. Let me carry you on a thought for just a few minutes. Paul is allowing culture of people to affect what he does to Timothy. In other words, Paul is thinking these folks that are of Jewish background are not going to listen to Timothy at all. In other words, he's really not going to even get his foot in the door because he has a Greek father. They know it. And they know he's not circumcised, so they're not going to allow him, they're not going to listen to him. They're not going to allow him in their presence. They're not going to pay heed to anything that he says. And so consequently, they're going to be at a distance. Now, evidently, Timothy is very impressive, and that's why Paul wants to take him. But his effect on the Jewish population, which is who, in many ways Paul was going to be talking to, although Paul was sent, according to Galatians chapter 2, to who? To the Gentiles. Paul had kind of made an agreement with Peter and others. He'd go to the Gentiles. But still, Timothy would have no positive, powerful impact upon the Jewish community because he wasn't circumcised, because his father was Greek. And so Paul said, I'm sure he told Timothy, hey, you want people to listen to you, you're going to be circumcised. Now, how much do we become like the community that we're trying to teach today? In other words, if we're trying to study with a guy that is a drunk, do we become drunk with him in order to try to teach him the gospel? Or the drug addict, do we take drugs with him and say, oh, by the way, hey, I got this great verse, while you're both stoned? No. The idea of becoming all things to all men that we might by all means win some or gain some is the idea of trying to approach people upon their level. But in approaching people upon their level, we cannot stoop to their level at all times. Now, sometimes you can. In other words, would there be anything wrong, if you will, if you're trying to minister to the homeless people to become homeless? No. Francis Chan. If you read religious books and you read books by Francis Chan, his way especially would sort of, that's what he would say. He would say, you got to do that. It is somewhat hypocritical, isn't it, to be in a big house, and big house can be relative, because a big house to somebody that's homeless is anything over 100 square feet, that you can stay in. But it is somewhat hypocritical to stay in a big house and to throw a few dollars at somebody and say, hey, I understand. But to help them out, they need that money, and so that's fine. But it's the idea of how far do we go? Now, but Paul, you said something about it's even affecting our worship today in some places. It is. It is. To this extent. Not from a standpoint of just tearing the worship up, but from a standpoint of dress. Watch videos. I watch a lot of videos of preachers and congregations that I know and love. And preachers have on jeans and polos. There's nothing wrong with that, in my estimation. The Bible, as far as that I've read, says nothing about, other than modest apparel, says nothing about what we wear to church. It really doesn't. It says nothing about what we wear, with regards to when you come to worship, here's what you wear. Think about it. We've got on coats and ties, several of us just open shirts. It's fine. I know of a congregation that went as far as to say, you couldn't wear the ladies couldn't wear shorts, even modest shorts, but you couldn't even wear sandals. That's how far this eldership went. You couldn't wear sandals. And so the thought hits me when I heard this was, we would have had to left Jesus outside because he wore sandals. But when we look today, preachers say, okay, and here's what I say, or here's what I hear among preachers. Well, I dress like this because coats and ties run some people off. Okay. Yeah. Well, here's my answer. And I have several different stages. First of all, if you're going to the president, you're going to go see the president of the United States. You're invited to the White House. What are you going to wear? I'm going to put on a suit. Yeah. Okay. So you're coming to worship God. Yeah. And you don't think enough of, well, it runs people off. Okay. How many people are coming to church in the last year because you're, as a preacher, not wearing a suit anymore? You're wearing blue jeans and a polo. Well. And when they start stuttering, you already got them. And they start stuttering. Bless their hearts, they start stuttering. I want visitors, and let me say this, I want visitors to feel comfortable. When they walk in here, I want them to feel comfortable. I want them to feel welcomed. I want them to feel at ease. I don't want to put them on a spot. For the abundance of dress or the lack of dress, as long as it is modest. Let me say that again. God doesn't tell you what you got to wear. I want to be careful with visitors. I want them, like I say, I want them to feel welcomed. I want them to feel a part of. But I also don't want to let culture affect me to the point that I say this is the way it's got to be, or we're not going to be successful. I sat at a luncheon. I went to a luncheon Monday of this week. And preachers, this is the way we look at things. There's luncheons, workshops, and then lectureships. Luncheons are just that. You eat lunch, and there's usually a 15 to 30-minute speaker, and you go your way. And so that's what we did. We ate lunch, and we had a speaker. The speaker was a young man, just not long ago finished his PhD. He's already made it into a book. He had a good thought, but his thought was carried too far. His thought was that visitors or folks that are outside of our buildings are hurting, and they know they're hurting. And when they come to church, we need to have lessons that deal with their hurting. And here was his idea 100% of the time. I agree. Not just people outside the building, but people inside the building hurting and need help, need peace, need hope, need comfort, need souls. Absolutely, 100%. Try to preach those sermons because they are needed. We all need them. But there are also times in which you have to preach about church, and there are times in which you have to preach about God, and there are times in which you have to preach about sin. Why? Because as a minister of God, I'm instructed by God to preach the whole counsel of God. And when I don't, I am not only neglecting my duties, but I'm not feeding the congregation everything that's needed. And so I wanted to tell the young man, didn't. I left. I talked to 2 or 3 and then I left. But I wanted to tell the young man, there's a word that he needs. That's not it. And the word is balance. Balance. Sometimes we need doctrinal issues addressed and talked about. This morning, our sermon is on the Lord's Supper. Scriptural, doctrinal, needs to be addressed. Next Sunday, not 100% sure, but it'll probably be along the lines of hang in there, don't give up. Lord willing, probably not probably, it's scheduled. That doesn't mean I can't change, but September and October, we're going to look at on Sunday mornings, we're going to look at the 7 sayings of the Savior on the cross. Week before Thanksgiving, we're going to have a Thanksgiving sermon. I'll tell you now, I've been saving this up, been thinking about this, but we're going to do something in December that I hope y'all don't kick me out of here for it. We're going to sing what would be considered traditionally Christmas songs. Once every Sunday morning in December, we're going to sing have Joy to the World, and the ones that are in our book, thus that we can put on, and we're going to have a sermon. Jesus as our King, Jesus as our light in December. And then on Sunday nights in December, you remember the old Jimmy Stewart movie? You remember what it's called? It's Christmas. It's a what? Wonderful Life. We're going to talk about It's a Wonderful Life on Sunday night in December, found in Romans chapter, my favorite verse, or one of my favorite, I have a lot, but one of my favorite verses, Romans 8. And we're calling the series, It's a Wonderful Life. So you see, you get that balance. Doctrine, things that are heartwarming and encouraging. And you do all that. You might say, preacher, how in the world did you find all that in that? Well, it's just things that we're dealing with. Something somebody likes to say, maybe I've hit a nerve. Maybe I went too far. Hopefully not. But this is what the early church was dealing with, and it's what we're dealing with as well. Now, like I say, if a preacher comes out and if he has on sandals and blue jeans and polo, I might look at him like this, but I'm not going to condemn him. I'm just not. But I wished he would think about it. But a tie does not make a good sermon. Okay? And somebody asked me, said, why do you wear a tie on Sunday night? And I said, because I'm too lazy to take it off Sunday afternoon. So it doesn't mean that I have to come in one, but I'm just too lazy to take it off. And I also feel like certain ones wanted a certain way, and okay, I'm all right with that. And so I don't have a problem with it. But anyway. Church, those in the church are people. Yeah. I agree. Dress aspect. I grew up in a home that was he went to the hospital. He went to church. Those are things. Is it right or is it? But I think they're acceptable and respectable. I've been reading recently churches around really big into church planting, and a lot of these topics. Mm-hmm. And there seems to be liberal and things that I think the sexual aspect of something that we don't like has filtered into the church, and it is dividing churches, and it needs to be addressed. Yeah. And there are, there's scriptures that we can point that this is the way God looks. So if you know that these people living this lifestyle, then should you post that subject in out in information? I don't know. Yeah. It's when you address subjects from a preacher pulpit standpoint, it has to be balanced, I think. First of all, it has to be scriptural, at least in the approach that you take. It's a matter of sometimes, at least when I go about choosing sermons, it's not who it affects, but how many does it affect. In other words, looking at our congregation, what I'm about to say, I'm going to say with all the love I know how. But looking at our congregation, to talk about abortion would be all right from the standpoint of scripture. And it might help us from the standpoint of dealing with our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren. But there's not many that make up this congregation that are fixing to have to deal with that. We're past that age, and we're past that stage in our life. It's not to say that it doesn't need to be talked about. It's not to say that it doesn't need to be addressed, but we need to be careful. We need to be loving, and we also, in preaching, and I learned this very early on, the idea of private is very true. And I've told you this story a couple of times about, and I'll just refresh your memory about this lady that called me up one Monday morning, wanted to know how in the world I knew, how in the world did I know, how in the world did I know, and I kept saying, what in the world are you talking about? And it was my sermon Sunday morning, da 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 da. So I carried my sermon. I just finally said, I don't know what you're talking about. Can I come see you? Can I come to your house? Absolutely. So I went to her house, carried my sermon with me, and which was on a 4x6 card, and she couldn't make heads nor tails of it. And if I carried her the sheet that I actually wrote it on to begin with, she still couldn't have made heads and tails about it, because I can't make heads and tails about it, and I wrote it. But anyway, the upshot of it is that I had preached a sermon on getting along with your neighbor, and her next door neighbor, who was a member of the church, who brought her to church every Sunday. That next door neighbor had a young son, and this lady was having problems with the young boy. Gary was 17 at the time, I think, and she was having problems with him. And so she said, I was preaching right to her, had no clue. Because, like I say, that lady carried her to church every Sunday. They sat together at church. So you don't know what goes on and what people do. And so, yeah, you have to be very careful. But you also have to understand you don't know what folks are doing, positive and negative. You have to be careful. Anything else? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Oh, yes. I'll give you, for instance, I had a guy once that um, I asked him, he was a young guy, and he told me this is what's going to happen. And I asked him a question. He followed me, and this was in between Bible study and worship. So I just asked him a question, and he followed me in between Bible study and worship to my office. I hollered at him. No, I didn't holler at him. I said, you don't know what my hollering's like, evidently. But that's right. But I had asked the question because I wanted to know why, and basically that was my question. Simple word, why? Or I think that my real response was, that's fine, but why? Well, the reality of it is I knew better than to ask him a question, because when you ask this young guy a question, he became defensive. So, like I say, it was innocent. It was truly in love. Just wanted to know the why. But he said I hollered at him. No, like I say, I didn't even come close. I didn't even come close to even raising my voice. So anyway, but he cut me off pretty good. Anything else? So yes, you have to be careful, but still, once we say it, people have to interpret it. And sometimes in that interpretation, it gets messed up. Very true. Anything else? Well, notice, let's I know I'm past time, but pick up verse 4 and verse 5. And as they went through the cities, they delivered to them the decrees to keep. The decrees, the word decrees, there's a declaration, but it's a declaration with authority. So they were talking about the words of God, which was determined by the apostles and elders of Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened. They grew. They grew in faith, but they also grew in number. So they increased physically and spiritually. Okay. And so the church is growing at that point in time. We're going to pick up then with the Macedonian call there in the 6th verse, unless somebody has something else. Well, let's bow right quick for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful to you for this day, for the blessing of it, for the opportunity to study your word, for the fact that we do love you and we are trying our best to do as you would have us to do. And we are reaching out and reaching to others and trying to share with them what we believe with regards to the good news. And we ask that the efforts that we put forth might be fruitful and that hearts might be touched and moved, and that individuals might come to you because of our lives and our words. We ask that you be with us as we enter into this period of worship, that we'll worship you in spirit and in truth. We also ask that you be with those that will be in the announcements, that you watch over them, bless them, and that you restore them, if it be your will, to their much normal walks of life. Watch over us now, bless us, keep us, and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week.